Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we're speaking with Judith Sornberger, a native Nebraskan who lives in the Appalachian Mountains of north-central Pennsylvania now, where her nearest neighbors are deer, bears, coyotes, and bobcats. Judith Sornberger's most recent collection of poems is Practicing the World, which is forthcoming in 2018 from Cavan Carey Press. She's the author of one other full-length poetry collection, Open Heart, from Calyx Books, and 5 chapbooks, most recently Walmart Orchid, winner of the Helen K. Chapbook Prize. The Hard Grammar of Gratitude won the Tennessee Chapbook Competition. Her prose memoir, The Accidental Pilgrim, Finding God and His Mother in Tuscany, is from Shanti Arts Publications. Sornberger has taught creative writing in many venues. Her first teaching job was at the Nebraska State Penitentiary and the Lincoln Correctional Center. She recently retired from 25 years teaching writing at Mansfield University of Pennsylvania, where she also created the Women's Studies program and served as its director. The mother of adult twin sons, Sornberger lives with her Maltese puppy, Birdie, and her bear-chasing cat, Billy Bob. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be talking with you today.
I am pleased, too. And I heard you giggle when I mentioned your puppy's name, Birdie, and the bear-chasing cat, Billy Bob, which is a funny image. We'll have to talk about that. But also, I know that they're with you, and so should they want to participate, that's fine.
Okay, good. They often have plenty to say.
Okay. All right. So you have been, according to your bio, in at least 3 different geographical locations. You're from Nebraska. You taught in Colorado. Thank you. And now you live in Pennsylvania. I might open our discussion asking how those 3 geographies may have influenced your writing.
Well, Nebraska, there's the whole plains aesthetic, I guess I would call it. Part of that is you think of Ted Kooser when you think of Nebraska, I think. And he was actually a neighbor of mine and a friend, very plain-spoken guy, and I think of that as being kind of a Nebraska trait, the heartland sort of thing. Colorado was kind of exciting because, and I had kind of a love-hate relationship with Colorado. I moved there for my husband. My husband was starting a PhD program there, and I went there and I was finishing my program from afar from there. I loved many things about Colorado, but I found often there was a kind of satisfied self loving of being like Colorado natives are better than anybody. And for all of you who are from Colorado, of course they are. I found that a little irritating sometimes. Anyway, as a writer, there was a really great poetry scene there, and so it was really easy to get together with other poets and work on your work together and be inspired by each other's work. Here in Pennsylvania, it took me a long time to feel like this was going to be a good place for me. It is very, very beautiful here, which is great, but it's very isolated where I live, in the area where I live. And so there aren't a lot of other writers around. I miss that. It's been a challenge to find other writers to exchange work with, and at least locally. But the landscape itself has informed my writing a lot. The beauty here, the animals, the birds, and that's been a real blessing and a gift.
Well, I think from what you said, you're talking about coming from an area where people and writers are plain-spoken to an area where you did find an active poetry scene, so you were able to connect with a lot of people in person, even if you weren't native from Colorado, and that now you're isolated in a beautiful place. And you're also there in retirement. So that's interesting to me. I mean, do you find that the beauty of there and the isolation and the fact that you're not working encourage your writing?
In many ways, it does encourage my writing. I think that the challenge for me has been trying to find a really good rhythm for solitude and writing. It's easy in retirement, I've discovered, to just fill your life up with all kinds of stuff, volunteer things, social outings with friends, all that kind of stuff.
So even though you're isolated, you still have lots of distraction.
Oh, yeah. Plenty of distraction.
Yeah.
And when I was teaching, it seemed like I only had certain pockets of time when I could write. So I had to make use of those. And now it seems like, oh, well, I can do it this afternoon or tomorrow. Something I've been working on a lot lately is just finding a really good rhythm for writing and not putting it off or procrastinating.
Besides rhythm, have you found something that works to just compel you to write no matter what at some point?
I just do love to write. And if I get excited about an image or an idea or a line, it's much easier to write.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing I do, I call it the Roberta Mickle method, which that was my mother's name. When she had something that she needed to do, and for some reason she was procrastinating, she would set the timer for 30 minutes, and she would do whatever it was. And if she was okay doing it, she would continue. Otherwise, she got to do whatever she wanted for the next 30 minutes or an hour. And so I sometimes do that with writing.
It makes sense to me. I like that idea. So you don't feel like it's a life sentence.
Exactly, which it is, of course.
Right, which definitely leads me to my next question, which is when you think back, when did you start writing and when did you make yourself into a committed writer?
I loved playing around with poems and especially rhyming kinds of things when I was a kid and as a teenager. I had a wonderful creative writing teacher in high school who had us write something every day in a notebook. It was such a wonderful thing to know you had to do it every day. I guess she graded them, but mostly it was just whether you did it or not. And that was the first time I realized that even if you didn't have an idea, you could come up with something every day if you sat down. That started working in my head around then. And then in my 20s, as my children got to the age where they could go to school, and I returned to college, I didn't get my BA until I was 30. And I was a single parent at this time. That's kind of when I realized, if I'm going to write, I can't wait until after this or after that or after the kids grow up or whatever. It just has to be now or never. And I think that's my late 20s. Would be when I really became a committed writer.
So you became a committed writer before you got your BA?
Yes. And I was publishing poems before then, too.
You knew the ropes somehow. You figured it out.
Yes. Yeah.
And was any of it connected to having been a friend and neighbor of Kuzer?
It was happening before I met him. I was taking some classes. I was working full-time at a university at Nebraska, and then I could take a free class every semester. So I was taking some writing classes. And then I met Ted, a girlfriend of mine, and I were sitting outside on my front porch drinking wine while our kids played in the front yard. And we were looking at a poem of mine. And all of a sudden, Ted was coming by in his truck, and he stopped the truck in front of my house. I mean, we knew each other, but not real well. And he said, "Is that a poem you're working on?" And we said, yes. And so he got out, and he looked at the poem, and he made some suggestions. And then the next week, he called me up, and he said, "Do you want to form a writing group together?"
Oh.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So sometimes the people we idolize for their poetry end up right in our lives.
That's right. Yeah.
I like that story very much. And I think that when you do follow your heart to writing, you do find yourself in situations where wonderful things happen.
Oh,
so
I think so, too.
I love that image of him stopping his truck and saying, "Is that a poem you're working on?"
I know. It was so great.
No, it's not a shopping list. Maybe the wine was the clue.
Maybe.
Now that we've talked about that and you've got several books of poems out, do you feel that when you've completed a volume of poetry, it informs your writing in a new way or your life?
I don't know about informing it afterwards. It's more like it informs it during. Usually it's the feeling like, okay, well, I've done that. Now what's the next thing? My first collection, Open Heart, was poems mostly about family and both my family of origin and my family with my children. And then Bruce came along when they were 7. Family and girlfriends, female friendships. I got really interested in dramatic monologues, and I wrote a couple of chapbooks around those. One's called Bifocal's Barbie, a Midlife Pantheon, where I let different women who seem to disappear after they're young in fairy tales and myths and popular culture sort of disappear then, but in this little chapbook, they come back as midlife women with new things to say. And then there was one called Walmart Orchid. Several of the poems actually take place in Walmart, and some of them have to do more with just kind of the whole rural experience, especially because I live in a rural area that is very impoverished. So anyway, I guess what happens is that I get these sort of enthusiasms, and it's wonderful to be in a series because it's sort of like writing a book. You don't feel like you're sitting down to an absolute blank page every day. Your mind is always kind of humming along with whatever that focus is.
Sounds like you're very astute at finding a way to publish them as chapbooks as opposed to thinking they had to be part of a bigger book.
Right. I wish some of these would become part of bigger books, but yeah, that it works that way.
Yeah, and all of them sound quite interesting, the premise of these chapbooks. And so then you didn't really speak yet about the hard grammar of gratitude, which was also
right.
one.
That doesn't have quite as much of the recognizable focus, but I think many of the poems do have something to do with needing to ask someone for help and being grateful. Prayer. One's about my sister getting a lung transplant and how difficult it was to be so joyful about her getting the lung, but feeling very sad about the 18-year-old boy who died in a car accident so she could have it.
Mm-hmm.
And one's about a really bad shoulder injury, and yet dancing with my husband in the kitchen, even with my cast on.
Well,
so
right.
I guess a lot of them have to do with the things that we're grateful for, but there's some kind of complexity about them.
Right. It really sounds wonderful and deep. And I'm thinking of Keats's term negative capability.
Yes. Yeah.
One thing and its
exactly.
opposite held in the same piece of writing.
Yeah.
So, and that's very enriching because that's all of life, kind of. And then, I don't know if The Hard Grammar of Gratitude was written before or after your prose memoir, Accidental Pilgrim.
That's a good question. It was published afterwards, but the prose memoir actually had been written quite a few years before it was published. So that book was written first, but it was published later. The Accidental Pilgrim.
The reason I'm asking is because I read a little bit about the Accidental Pilgrim, and it talks about your journey from not being religiously involved to turning to some religious tenets and prayer. And you mentioned that in The Hard Grammar of Gratitude, some of the poems are prayers. So what was it like for you as a poet to begin writing a prose memoir?
I had written essays before, but I had never had this idea that I was going to write a whole prose book until actually when I went to Tuscany. I went during a sabbatical, and my idea was I wanted to write. I'd been really drawn to the figure of the Virgin Mary even before I kind of returned to church, and I'd been especially interested in paintings of the Annunciation where Gabriel comes to announce that she's going to become the mother of the Son of God. And for some reason, I just had this huge hunger to see those paintings. And I thought, well, where better to go than Tuscany, Florence, and Siena, and those kinds of places. I enlisted the help of a friend, and she went with me. And my whole plan was to write a book of poems. And I have written some poems, of course, about some of those paintings, some ekphrastic poems. But what happened was it really turned into this whole different experience from what I thought it was going to be, into kind of a very unwilling conversion experience. I ended up writing about that when I got home. Luckily, I kept a really close journal while I was gone. But I was only gone 2 weeks, and it became a book.
Following your heart and your compelling need to see those paintings really led to a huge life change.
Exactly, exactly.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend. In case you just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Sheila is talking with Pennsylvania poet and essayist Judith Sornberger about her poems born both from loss and from new love.
Well, this would be a very good time for you to read from your work if you can.
I'd be happy to. You were talking about the whole issue of having lost a love.
And that loss was Bruce, who you mentioned just before.
Yes, my husband of 30 years. And then at the same time, or at least some overlap between that time and a time of meeting someone new and starting a new relationship. So I have a couple of poems here, if you have time for two, that deal with that. And the first is called From the Second Summer, and I believe I wrote this poem in one of your workshops, in one of your online classes, which, of course, are wonderful. The second summer here refers to the second summer after my husband died, but it was also the first summer of a new relationship. So it's called From the Second Summer. Digging in the flower bed where I tucked your ashes. Do you mind the lady's mantle from my new love's garden? I dropped petal-shaped pellets in the pond my lover made me. Gold and white koi shimmer to the surface, nip and dart off, as though what they desire terrifies them. Devastated by his beloved's death, Nicholas Culpeper studied the healing properties of plants. Lady's mantle, he wrote, could be used for wounds both inside and outside. When the milky oval sky fell from my silver ring, my lover glued it into place. As he presents it to me, do I tell him the ring was your last gift? This morning, a solitary deer gazes at us from the lawn's edge, even takes a few steps in our direction before vanishing into the woods.
I'd love to say something in response.
Sure, please do.
It's a beautiful poem. And what I hear in it is both where you are now, where the wildlife is there for you, the plants are there for you, and how beautifully you allow that moment of remembering to coincide with the current moments of the gift of the new love who can fix this ring from the old love. It's just beautiful that you allow that to happen. So I just wanted to say that before you go on. But yes, we'd love to hear it.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And then this one is called Koda, 3 Autumns After Your Death. And this poem is the last poem in the new collection that's coming out next year, which is called Practicing the World. So this poem was actually written a little bit more than a year after the poem I just read. So Koda, 3 Autumns After Your Death. Before the first tree goes bald on our mountain, half the neighbors have flown off to Florida, the never land for grown-ups, where their other lives await, hanging like brightly patterned ghosts in condo closets. Sometimes I envy that existence where not a tree in sight insists that you must die. But if I followed, who would note the 3 subspecies of red oak outside my living room window? One high noon yellow, one the cerise and gold of sunset, one the deep scarlet of a pierced heart. I stand with them as I stood that late November beside you, when the leaves lay limp and tarnished copper underneath their trunks, beside the slim bed where you lay in your last days, arranged so we could watch the first snowfall, slow, momentous, each flake perhaps the final word on beauty.
Well, that breaks my heart in a good way. It's really beautiful, and you've allowed yourself to do, I think, what poets do best, which is to observe very closely, often nature, and then to associate. And the neighbors are leaving, are gone to a land where the trees don't lose their leaves, and they don't have to think about death and loss.
Right.
At least in that moment, that's what you think, and then you think about your own. They're beautiful, thank you. And it leads me to want to ask you, did you write the poem about the trees and Bruce while you were already with a new person?
Yes.
What's that like?
There's this part of me that almost feels disloyal when I write of Carl, my new love. I feel a little disloyal toward Bruce, the memory of Bruce. And then when I write this poem about Bruce, I feel a little bit of disloyalty toward Carl because he and I have been together over 3 years now. But it's funny, the first time I ever read Carl, the poems, after I'd put together the manuscript of Practicing the World, I read him some of the poems. And Carl is not a real literary guy. I mean, he's hugely intelligent, but he's not a writer or a lover of poetry. But when I read these poems to him, he started just tears going down his cheeks. So he'd excuse himself. He'd go get a Kleenex. He'd come back. And then I'd read a few more, and then he'd have to go get another Kleenex. So he really got it. He really got it that I could completely be committed to a new relationship with him while I still so much loved Bruce and the memory of him. So, in fact, he once said, I think I really would have liked Bruce. You know, he sounds like such a great guy. He said, but I would have had to kill him because we love the same woman.
Well, I'm glad that your dark humor is alive, but his feelings, I mean, your description of how he received those poems is, of course, what we would like all of the readers of our poems to feel. And the fact that poetry has to tell the truth, and the truth is complex.
That's right.
That poem about him fixing the ring includes that feeling of disloyalty as well as new loyalty, as well as the coming together of the network of people in your life, whether they're here or gone. And we just have to let the poems say what they're leading us to say, right?
Absolutely.
Or recognize what they're leading us to say.
Yes, that's right. That's it. Recognizing. Because, as you know, we don't know what they're going to say when we start them.
And if we did worry too much about that, there are so many occasions upon which a writer feels guilty for, let's in quotes, having to say their truth, that we wouldn't have the wonderful writing that we have in the world if writers gave in to that feeling. But even that feeling is something to write about, and I think it comes through in the poem about gardening. And the poem about trees, it's just one of those moments where you'll always think about those days, with pleasure as well as with grief.
That's right.
So I already feel edified by listening to those. Thank you. And I know you taught for a long time after you did obviously get graduate degree. What would you tell people who long to write poems or are blocked in writing poems?
Well, I think for me, when I feel blocked, the thing that works the best for me is reading poems by other people. And I think one of the things that was hard for me before I returned to college and got my undergraduate degree was, well, where do I find poems? I knew I loved Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, the writers I'd learned about even in high school and some early college classes. But where do I find those contemporary poets? I think it may be a little bit easier now than it was way back then, but I think being in a class helped me a lot. For one thing, taking a class like the ones that you teach, I think would be very helpful to people. Also, just going to your neighborhood independent bookstore, which those are fewer and farther between these days, but I'm very, very grateful to have one in my small town, and perusing the poetry section. I really feel like the best thing I can do for myself as a poet is read other poetry. And I always told my students that I thought I was a really great teacher, but really the best teachers were poems.
Yes. And so who are some of the people that you love to read?
Well, I'm fairly eclectic. I tend to gravitate most toward women poets, maybe because I grew up reading mostly male poets. But my friend Allison Townsend, whose work you know, is one of my very favorite poets. Well, I love Ted Kuzer's work, of course. I love Linda Hogan's work, Joy Harjo, Tony Hoagland. I like Billy Collins a lot. I tend to appreciate poetry that is accessible. I don't mean that I can't understand more what some might consider obtuse poetry or language poetry or something, but I tend to go for poetry that has a lot of heart. Avon Boland.
Well, that's a good list. I appreciate it. I just want to add, when you say about bookstores, there still are poetry readings available for people to listen to a poet read and then know a lot more about their poems, like we know a lot more about your poems now from what you could tell us. The Internet, if people who live in isolated areas, it's amazing to me how much you can hear, not just read, but if you go to the Poetry Foundation online. You can hear poets reading from their work as well as reading their poems, a sampling anyway. Billy Collins has his wonderful website. Was it Poetry 180?
I have to look for that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it is. And when he was poet laureate, he had a project where he wanted schools across America to have a poem read, not read and received by the students once a day. And there were 180 days in the school year for the most part. And over the years since then, the site has many more poems than just 180. So there's many ways to sample and then go to a bookstore and sample more. And I know that my very first poetry professor said, that was David Wagner. He said, in order to...
Oh, look at you.
Yeah, I learned a lot. But he was very intimidating. And he said, in order to be a poet, you must read everything that's ever been published in poetry in the English language. So we have a big task ahead of us, but just to read a few poems before you start writing seems like good advice. And I want to thank you so much for that good advice. So do you have another? We have just about another minute. Do you have another good piece of advice for us?
A good piece of advice. Well, find other writers. If you want to write poetry, find other poets and get together on a regular basis. Share your work and discuss it and talk about what it feels like to write and to be blocked in your writing. Share your work. I mean, I find that often the most inspiring things for me are just reading my friends' poems, but also sharing our struggles with the written word.
I think that's really important because when we read just published work, we don't get to see what it looked like before it became what it now is. And
that's right.
And that's a wonderful gift to give somebody, is the ability to help them through that by your responses, and also to see that you're not alone in looking at a beginning and what to make of it. And then in addition, if you do it outside with a glass of wine, you might have a famous poet stop by and ask you if that's a poem.
He wasn't quite as famous back then.
Oh.
That was before he was poet laureate and so forth. But he had a couple books out from Pitt, so that's
pretty
at least one out from Pitt by then. Yeah,
that counts.
Yeah.
I just again want to thank you so much for participating in our program.
Thank you.
I look forward to more books and to hearing how you're doing in your new spot. It sounds like it's actually quite fertile for you to be there.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judith.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman.